Hi, and welcome to the nightcap of our LinkedIn Live doubleheader on the release of the ISM Report on Business. I am still Dan Zeiger, Senior Writer and Copy Editor for Insight Supply Management, Institute for Supply Management's member publication, and we're excited to have you with us as we discuss the Manufacturing PMI data for February, which was released on Monday. A little bit different situation than we have here than normal today, since we've had a couple of days to digest the data, and there's also been some news over the last day and a half. The composite index reading of 50.3% could have been heralded as a major development, considering it meant consecutive months of expansion for the manufacturing sector for the first time in more than 2 years. But it was somewhat overshadowed by an increase in the prices index and some continuing tariff anxieties, which we'll discuss. So let's get on to the second half of our doubleheader. I still have my ball here, and I'm happy to introduce, as he steps into the batter's box, Timothy R. Fiore. He's the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Services Business Survey Committee. So, hey, Tim, how you doing? And what stood out to you, not only in the February numbers, but as I said, as we've had a couple of days to digest them.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I did hear today that the administration has paused the tariff deployment on Mexico and Canada. I'm very happy to hear that. Emotional, traumatic. I don't think it really had much of an impact. It probably stopped a whole bunch of deliveries crossing the border in the last 24 hours, but in any event, it's been lifted. So before we're done with this, we'll talk about whether this is really something that's going to happen or it's something that's just being used to negotiate. We'll talk about that before this is over. But back to Dan's point, this month did look good. It looked okay, 50.3, just slightly down from the 50.7, whatever it was in January. But if you look at the fundamental elements of the 5 sub-indexes that make up that PMI number, they had changed substantially. And it changed the whole message as it did on Monday on release. The first, as Dan said, when it first came out, people felt pretty good. Oh, okay, we're not growing much, but we're still expanding nonetheless. Until they understood that what really drove that number to be at that level was the prices index that also impacted the new order number, the manufacturing inventory number, as well as the supplier delivery number. So in the supplier delivery number, as you know, anybody who's been following this knows that I include that and inventory in inputs. So if you had just used the input numbers from January, if January was on inventory was 45. If the rate of change had stayed the same as January, then this PMI number would have been 48 and some small change. So I think that's the real message here, is that we actually had a decline in performance in the month. It was kind of hidden because we had a bump up in inputs because of negative factors that drove those numbers up. And we should get into that, Dan. So whenever you want to pursue that demand, we'll talk about demand, we'll talk about outputs, we'll talk about inputs when you're ready.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll let you lead that conversation. But I do want to, prices, as you said on Monday, were the story of the month. So yeah, we can start with that, I guess. 62.4% was the prices index reading. It was the largest month-over-month increase in that index since it went up 7.7 percentage points in January of 2024. And you had discussed on Monday that there may be some recovery that we'll see in the next few months in certain indexes, but with the prices index, you weren't so sure. You want to discuss that dynamic a little bit?
Yeah, sure will.
Yeah.
So what happened was when the Trump administration announced the tariffs on steel and aluminum, those are commodity markets, and immediately upon announcing the 25% tariffs on all imports, steel and aluminum, the spot market price began to move. Within the last 30 days, which is when this thing came about, we've seen an increase in steel and the Midwest differential of about 30%. And the tariffs haven't even gone into place until next week. So, in the commodity markets, that's what's going to happen. With tariffs on finished goods and intermediate products, it probably will not be anywhere near as fast. But in the commodity markets, it absolutely did, because if you're a U.S. steel producer and a month from now, your prices are going to be 25% higher, you're going to jump your price right away, because nobody has a choice, especially with long lead times items. So the commodity prices went up right away. We saw an impact. I think it's somewhere around 33% of our respondents had rising prices in the month of February. Wow, that's up from maybe 12 or 13% the prior month. So what that did, for those of you who are in the supply business, because I know many of you are, what it did was it caused a stall in the placement of new orders. Because as you as a buyer, you go to get your supplier to take an order, he's not going to take that order unless you agree to either bear the full cost of the tariffs or to share in the cost of the tariffs. So you've been in these seats before. This happened to us 6 years ago. The arguments begin about who's going to pay for this. And, it's an issue of leverage at any given point in time. You try to keep the partnerships together. No one just kind of accepts the price growth. And, in our forecast back in December of last year, the year before, in December 23, I think the number came in at 22% of our respondents said that they were not able to pass price increases through to their customers. In December of 24, that number jumped to 44%. So being able to pass this stuff on through to the customers is nowhere near as easy as it has been during the pandemic recovery period. So that was the impact on new orders. We saw about a 6.5-point drop in the new order number, which, okay, that's not a good thing. And for those of you who follow this, that new order number is a really good surrogate for the Beige Book Federal Reserve's industrial production numbers that are 6 weeks away, I think it is. They're much later, but they really watch our new order number because it absolutely trends where their IP number ends up. Okay, so that's a new order number. And remember now, this is without counter tariffs. There really hasn't been any counter tariff activity of any significance yet. Although there could have been some in there. I think China has put some counter tariffs on us. So then we get down into the, so let's talk, let's stay on demand. So the new order number got hit. New export number was relatively stable, still expanding, but not very strong. Our backlog is declining again, but not as fast, which is good, 46 or 47. We're heading in the right direction. And the customer inventory number was still in the too low range. I think it was about midpoint of too low. I don't think it was way too low. So, okay, the demand number is concerning, but I think it's a temporary thing because they're going to have to resolve this pricing dispute. And it will get resolved. And it will get resolved when the buyer has to resolve it because they have to keep the factory running. And you know how that ties in with lead times and everything. So whether it gets resolved in March or resolved in April, it will get resolved. What will not get resolved is the pricing number sitting here. And before we've even seen big tariffs coming, the reciprocal tariffs and the Mexico-Canada tariffs that, thankfully have been stalled for another month, and we'll see. Okay, let's get into output. So output was pretty good. The production number was fairly stable month to month. I think it came in at 50.7. All right, not great, but consistent with January's number, which means that we got the revenue, we got cash flowing, but there clearly was a change in the sentiment about the future. In January, we were 2-to-1 positive. In February, we were 1.3-to-1. So the tariffs have started to erode the sentiment, the confidence level of our business panelists. And you can see that in the consumer confidence numbers too. Between January and February, the consumer confidence numbers dropped like 10 or 15%. So the tariff issue and the talk of tariffs and the constant changing of tariffs is causing this confusion, which in the business world, as you all know, means freezing. Stop everything. Let's wait until the picture is clear. Okay, so as I mentioned, the production number was fairly stable. The big surprise this month was the employment number continued to contract, not super strong, 47.6, 48. Okay, I had a question from Alex Steele about, hey, Tim, you said that the reductions in staff are going to slow down here. Why is it still continuing? Well, the reason it's still continuing is because there isn't a lot of confidence in the near-term future. So if you're sitting on the bubble and you got 10 people that you're not quite sure whether you should let go or hold on, it's all a function of when you think the economy is going to really start to recover. And with all this confusion around tariffs, the business community is saying, I'm not so confident. The positive thing is, up until this point, the predominant tool used has been layoffs. 50, 60% of the comments are supporting we're laying off. That's a last minute, most drastic paying severance activity. In the month of February, the strongest comments were attrition and plus the freezes. So, rather than lay people off, the majority of the people who are taking action were doing it through, okay, Joe left, so we're not going to replace him until we know what's going on. And I know you have a put on that you got in January for this year for this person. You're going to have to freeze on that until we know what's going on. That's the reason why the employment number sagged again. I'm pretty convinced of that. So, okay, makes a lot of sense. Now let's get into the input side, which I think is probably the bigger story. We jumped 5 points on the supplier, 3.6 points on the supplier delivery number. We went from 51 to call it 55. What would have caused that? It wasn't a huge spike in demand. Our production number came in at 50. It wasn't like we drew in more material. There was some pull forwards to kind of avoid tariffs. There wasn't any real port effects. I mean, I think that port strike is supposed to happen soon. Probably won't happen. I think what happened here is that suppliers were refusing to deliver until we had agreement on price structures. Because that's what happens when you've got a loggerheads. In normal times, when people forget about the last time we had disagreements in loggerheads, it takes a little bit more time to work it out. But with the tariffs fresh in our minds from not that long ago, and the post-pandemic recovery fresh in our minds from not that long ago, and the arguments we had about who's going to pay the increased cost then, suppliers just said, hey, look, until we agree with this, I'm not shipping you anything more. And I think that's why you see that 55 plus number on supplier deliveries. So on the surface, it looks like a good thing, but I don't think it's a good thing. I think it's up for non-good reasons, kind of like what happens in the hurricanes. We've talked about this many times. Hurricanes impact the supplier delivery number. The number goes up, which is supposed to be good, but it's actually not good. And but the other good thing here, though, that number probably won't stay elevated because, as I said, buyers and sellers have to resolve this. Sellers need the revenue, buyers need the product. So it will get resolved, but will not get resolved. And what's well outside of our control is the price index number.
Yeah. In the report, you had written that companies in February experienced what you called the first operational shocks of the new administration's tariff policy. And you cited, the good news, hopefully, that, with these pausing. But I mean, is that still going to just create more uncertainty? I mean, this is the second time this has happened.
Yeah, it is.
They want tariffs and they pause them,
Yeah, you're right. And it's funny because it's on the manufacturing PMI release date within a day or two. So we're kind of front and center. If you recall, a month ago, we were the first ones to indicate that there were some issues going on here. Then the market was collapsing too at the same time. And then Trump suspended the tariffs on Mexico and Canada right away. So, okay, he did it again. Okay, on the surface, you think, okay, this is really just to get some kind of concessions, but it's also very clear that they're trying to, they've approved the reconciliation budget. Now it's up to how do we reconcile? The only way you can reconcile is to save money somewhere. And the administration has been very clear about having the desire to launch the External Revenue Service. And the inputs for the External Revenue Service is primarily going to be tariffs. So if you're not tariffing $1 trillion of Canadian and Mexico goods, then you're not going to have any significant money to match in the reconciliation budget. So, just on the surface, $1 trillion of stuff, tariffed at 25%, that's $250 billion a year. And when they do these reconciliations, they do it on a 10-year horizon. And let's just talk real terms, near today's dollars. That's $2.5 trillion of benefit that they can use to offset the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, tax cuts for all individuals. And it's $2.5 trillion to support whatever money they want to spend on the border and whatever money they would want, extra money they want to spend on the budget. Is it real money or not? Well, it's probably as real as the insulin that President Biden used for his reconciliation budget, which we all knew that the insulin use was declining because it was being replaced by more modern drugs. But they still use it anyway as it was money found. So, we're in the same boat here. I was in a session this afternoon and somebody asked me, well, why don't they just go ahead and put the tariffs on, pass the reconciliation budget, then lift the tariffs? I'm not so sure it's that easy. This whole parliamentary reconciliation rules are a little bit confusing, but I would think that, sitting here today, I'm thinking that these tariffs are going to go in place because he needs the money and they'll stay in place for 2025. I don't think he's going to be able to lift them right away after the reconciliation budget, but I think that 3 or 4 months from now he probably could. So and he can kind of do whatever he wants anyway. But he's got to get through this reconciliation rules. He can't. I don't think there's any way they can change those rules. The parliamentarian has pretty strict rules, and even though the Republicans are in the majority, I don't think they can change it.
Yeah. One of the perils of doing a live broadcast, and I know Tim experienced this big time when he was doing interviews on the data a month ago, is that breaking news breaks, and sometimes it's incomplete. But one of our producers behind the scenes, our friends, let us know that apparently the report is that automotive parts and components are paused, according to a report in the Wall Street Journal, for 1 month, which is obviously pretty significant. But yeah,
not all of it.
Clarify that.
It's just automotive. I heard it was all of it.
You know what? I'll ask you this next question, and I will do some more research on it.
Okay.
Yeah, but despite the challenges, that we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about, you track the share of manufacturing GDP that is in strong contraction every month, and it's diminished in a way that's encouraging. Yeah, just talk about that, and how it reflects, the general strength of the sector, that it's improving.
Oh, transportation equipment. Yeah, we're struggling still, and I mean it's an interesting point, because 65% of the heavy duty trucks that are built for use in the U.S. are assembled in Mexico. But the value content, a huge amount of the value content, comes out of the U.S. For instance, the engines for PACCAR and for Volvo and for Freightliner all come from the U.S. And an engine system and transmission, again, U.S. based. Those things are probably 35-40% of the cost of a truck. So if they're giving relief to the automotive guys, which I hope they do, they should give relief to the other guys too. And I think they're going to have problems not. The other issue here on the tariffs, which was not clear this time around, the last time around, they had specifically excluded duty drawback, which almost makes it not really lawful. So what they're really saying is, if 50% of the cost of the product that you're shipping into the United States came from parts produced in the United States and then assembled in Mexico, normally that stuff is not tariffable. Normally you apply for a duty drawback and you get that money returned to you when the product is returned, when shipped into the United States. The original executive order putting these Canada-Mexico tariffs in place specifically excluded duty drawback, which the duties and tariffs are supposed to be on the value-added content. So why are you putting a tariff on something that there was no value add applied to? And in fact, you're tariffing your own product. So that's some of the confusion here. But sorry, hold on. Okay, so transportation equipment, we saw a real sag in new orders, in the month. We saw, we're still expanding. 51. January was 52. Not doing really well, and the primary reason for that is the long rates. It's the 10-year T-bill. We can't seem to get the long rates down, and the reason for that is that the financial community that establishes long rates based on what they know is happening in the market and what the Federal Reserve is charging for short rates, they're not confident that we've defeated inflation. That's why the long rates are staying up, and the long rates they're squashing the consumption of automobiles. The combination of 20% higher price tag MSRP on a car and probably a 150% increase on the financing cost of a car are keeping buyers out of the market. And this is why the automotive business is very slow. We're back in a mode now where our cars are aging out. There's probably more parts being used, but we're not turning our cars over properly because the long rates are too high. The other impact is on the construction industry, because you can't really afford the mortgages. We're what, 200% higher than where they were 3-4 years ago? That's too much for people to spend. When you do your calculations on, can I afford the monthly payment, if almost half of it is consumed by interest rates, interest rate change, it's going to keep you from going out and stepping up into a new home, which opens up homes now for the less fortunate or the first time buyers, and everybody's complaining about lack of housing. So we need the long-term rates to come down. And the only way they're going to come down is if the market has confidence that inflation is under control. And right now, the tariff activity is not providing that confidence. Now, what I will say about this inflation traditionally is defined as wage inflation, because wage inflation gets embedded. It gets embedded into the company. We've all gone through furloughs. How many people have actually had pay cuts in place where a whole company takes a 10% forever. I mean, we've had furloughs. Everybody takes a 10% cut for a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever, till the company gets out of trouble, and then they give you the money back. So that's really the typical definition of inflation, is wage increases. We're in a phase now that almost looks like transitory inflation that Jay Powell addressed back in 2021, 2022. Wow. So what's he going to do this time? You remember, he waited too long last time, and it became almost runaway, and eventually it fed into the wage side. And we were able to avoid this escalating wage increase after increase after. Fortunately, we were able to avoid it. So what's he going to do this time? He definitely learned the last time. This thing looks like transitory, supply shock driven, even though it's a tax, which if it was used to pay down the deficit, I think I'd feel better, but it's not going to be used for that. What's he going to do? It's going to be interesting to see where he goes on this. It's a tough call. My guess is he's surely going to pause for longer here on rate cuts. He may even, we could even be looking at rate increases.
Just to be on the record,
this is one of the issues with, and I've mentioned it before to the listeners. This is one of the problems with a soft landing.
Mm-hmm.
If we'd had a hard landing, you would have seen the higher wage earners probably retire out, and when business came back, they would have brought them back with lower wage. Earlier life cycle employees probably would have cut the cost per wage hour per company significantly, but we didn't have that. So we're starting at a higher base, and as you all know, we haven't whipped inflation yet. Our price index for 3 months now has preceded a CPI and a PPI flatness and or slight growth. With this kind of 64 number, it's very possible we're looking at 2.5. We're looking at maybe a 0.5 increase in the inflation rate. We'll see. It's going to be more than 0.1. It could be 0.3, and we haven't seen that in quite some time. So
yeah. Just to clarify, there's an AP story. President Trump is granting a 1-month exemption on new tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada for U.S. automakers.
So let's talk about what's left out. So what's left out is most of your televisions in the United States come from Mexico. They make them in Mexico. You got, like I mentioned, the trucks, and there's other consumer electronics that come out of Mexico too. Mexico is a significant supplier of electronics, automobiles, and trucks. And so he's giving a waiver to the automotive guys. It won't be long before he also gives a waiver to the truck guys, and probably he's probably going to waive it all. I mean, I don't know how you can penalize trucks or car. I don't know how you do that, but I will tell you, a lot of the product that goes into a Tesla comes out of Mexico. Right.
Well, let's one more index dynamic I wanted to ask you about that's related to tariffs. I mean, we talked about inventories last month, and we expected that number that would have been higher, considering some of the, tariff anxieties or trying to get ahead of it. It did go up. It did not go into expansion in February, but it did go up right onto the edge of expansion at 49.9%. Also, the import index was also up 1.5 percentage points to 52.6. Was that more of a sign to you that, maybe buyers were trying to get ahead of potential tariffs, despite the haggling they might have been having with suppliers on who was going to take it?
Yeah, well, you have some haggling, you have some taking, right? And then you have some taking anyway. So, I think, but I don't think a lot of it was import either, because that import number should have been 55. If that's the case, between the Lunar New Year ending and the deliveries from the tail end of the pre-Lunar New Year showing up in February, that import number should have been higher. And then, if you're trying to pull forward stuff from everywhere, that number should have been 58 or 59. But the inventory number at a 50 went up almost 4 points. I don't know that I've ever seen the manufacturing inventory number go up that much. And we're at the high end of where it normally is. I think I've rarely seen it be much more than 51. To have that drastic of a change so quickly, it was a combination of stuff. In any event, people were pulling forward stuff primarily to avoid cost increases. I think that's what it says. I mean, I don't know what else it could be saying. It's not because there's such a huge amount of demand, we want more inventory. So, and it's not because we had a slow production month, because production was at 50. So it had to be pulled forward, which kind of says that, well, we still may have pull forward now because Mexico and Canada they got a 1 month stay, but we're going to have reciprocal tariffs. What, a couple of weeks? That's coming. So, I think you're going to see some pull forwards continue. I would be surprised if that number is probably going to be 48 to 50. It's going to stay there. But, I think the supplier delivery number will ease. I think the new order number will kind of come back. But, we're still sitting at a 50, 51 and a half. It's not, not very positive. And I'm talking to a bunch of supply people here probably. We do not like tariffs. We do not like anything that prevents a free and flowing open market. And we're dealing with this. We know how to deal with this. You know how to deal with this. Deal with it as you have to. You got supply partners that you got to deal with. You got to figure out where that money's going. Ultimately, it's going to end up in a product, I'm convinced. Initially, it could be shared, and I'm sure many people will try. Try to keep your relationships in place through all of this, because that's what is sustainable. That's what lasts, is keep your relationships in place, but make sure you keep your job and do what your bosses tell you to do, because nobody wants to take this tariff cost. But as you all know, we have force majeure clauses, either written or not. And it says acts of God or government intervention. And this is a government intervention. It's like the top criteria for why you have force majeure. So you don't have, unless you've written it in your contract that no matter what tariff happens, or even if you put a tariff ban in your contract, I've tried to do that before, you're going to have to work it out and do your best to do that and not destroy your relationships with your key suppliers.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those months. We're getting toward the bottom of the hour here, and it was one of those months where I feel like we could go for another hour at least. But we got a minute or so left. Tim, anything that I haven't asked or anything that we haven't discussed that you feel might be important to include before we wrap it up?
I think we're in for a real roller coaster here. I think that's it's the moniker of the administration. They like a bit of confusion. They like a bit of holding cards close. We as business people do not like that. We like stability. We like predictability. And we're up against an administration that is 180 degrees the other way. So, and they're also combining things. This whole thing with USMCA is over fentanyl. And I think when I was coming back from my lecture a little while ago, I think in the month of January, the Canadian border captured a half a pound of fentanyl or something. So we're gonna end up tariffing 25% on what, $500 billion of goods because of a couple of half a pound of fentanyl coming in across the border. I don't know, but yeah. All right. Well, hey, we'll see what happens here. Like I said last month, I said I don't think we'll see tariffs on Mexico and Canada, but this whole thing about reconciliation is even more important. And I'm getting more and more convinced that they're going to try to find a way to do that, and it's going to be in place for the better part of this year. They're going to have to, and maybe this is why the one bill, two bill is the big discussion, that the administration doesn't want to let this drag out all the way to the end of the year, because they have to make decisions on tariffs because they announced it. If it's one bill, one beautiful bill, and it happens in the next couple of months, then maybe we'll have settled the reconciliation rules, and then the administration will have the ability to lift tariffs at some point after that.
Yeah.
Good luck, everybody.
Yeah, buckle up. It's certainly going to be never a dull moment. But yeah, thanks a lot, Tim. I really appreciated the time. Always learn a lot. And thanks for joining us today. For more information, feel free to go to ismworld.org, where you can read our roundup articles, both of them, both on the manufacturing that came out Monday and the services that came out today, that details a lot of what we've discussed here, for both sectors. And we'll see you back here in a month's time when we break down the March ISM report on business. And if you stuck to us with both ends of the doubleheader today, give yourself a helmet sticker. For Tim Fiore and some people who helped us behind the scenes, Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens, I'm Dan Zeiger, and we'll see you next time.